Hi everyone, this is Kelly and I'm here to talk about a difficult topic. So the title should be labeled fairly clearly if talking about illness, death, these types of things are something that is uncomfortable for you or something that you're just not prepared to think about and engage in today or any day, then this may not be the video for you. So I also want to say that I do have several different videos dealing with grief, my journey with grief, my journey with my son, and things of that nature. And I will put a link to those in the description box. I'm going to try to stay somewhat on task, and so there may be, it's not a this is my whole experience from A to Z, and so you may want to look at some of those other videos if you're kind of feeling like I'll try to give the basics, but my point is that I do have other videos covering grief and these types of things, and so I'll link to those below as well. So I was asked by a very dear lady who's been around for a long time on the channel, and who is dealing with the position that we sometimes find ourselves in, where we are not fighting anymore for cures, not fighting anymore for health or wellness or recovery with a loved one, but we are literally in the phase of waiting for somebody to die. I also have another very dear friend of mine, we went to college together, we've been friends forever, who is in that specific process with her father, coming actually down to the final days with her father. So, but I was asked by this particular lovely lady to address when you are in the situation in which you are having to wait for somebody to die, that it's not an active fight anymore. It's not an active looking for a cure and then you maybe die in the process of treatment, which happens, or an accident, which you, of course, is all of these factors surrounding death have different experiences, right? There are different things to deal with and different things to manage. If it's a out of the blue death that comes out of nowhere and you feel like you're not prepared for it, or it's a long struggle and in the midst of treatment the person passes away. There are different ways in which death expresses itself in our human experience, and each of those different ways do offer different obstacles and do offer different struggles. And so she asked, though, that could I address the version of I feel have the most experience with, which is when you are in that process in which there's nothing else that you can do, there's no more fighting, there's no more treatment, it's just a wait for death to come for somebody that you love, and or for yourself. Although from my perspective, obviously, I'm going to be speaking more about waiting for somebody that you love to pass. It's been a couple weeks since she brought it up. I will confess that it's a hard topic to dive into, and it's a hard topic to revisit when much of my adult life was literally spent in that process, although 3 years specifically, but much of my adult life was spent touching on these issues. And so stepping back into those feelings and those emotions and things is difficult. I'm not going to lie about that. It's difficult, and I kind of struggled with whether I wanted to do a video or whether I wanted to try to write it out, because that gives me a little bit more of a buffer, so to speak, and so allows me that space a little bit more to process. But I also did some rereading. I wrote a lot of poetry. Not all of it good poetry. I would say much of it probably not good poetry, but I wrote a lot of poetry throughout my high school years, but definitely in times in which I was going through all this, and I'm going to get to some backstory, I promise. But I wrote a lot of poetry, and I thought I lost it, to be honest. It wasn't on any of my I couldn't find it on any of my hard drives, and so I really was kind of, because I knew there were some particular poems that would actually have dates on them, and so I was kind of finding those. I was rereading a particular book, which we're going to talk about, and just kind of trying to process my way through the topic. And in some degrees dragging my heels and procrastinating diving into difficult conversation. One thing that I really do want to make very clear before I dive in here is that I am not a counselor. I am not a therapist. I am not a psychiatrist. I am not any of those things. And so what I am sharing is my personal experience. And if that helps even one person that is going through something similar, then that is worth the uncomfortableness of the topic. But it is just my experience. And the other side of that is that nobody's experiences are ever going to look exactly the same. Even if you're going through a similar thing, like waiting for somebody that you love to die. My pathway to making my personal peace with the situation, however successful or unsuccessful I've been, is never going to look the same as your path. And just because I work my way to a particular conclusion that allows me to process and carry forward does not mean that you will either come to the same conclusion or that you will get there in the same process. I cannot tell somebody how to find inner peace with the biggest topic of all, right? Which is life and death, birth and death. And these are huge, in the afterlife, like these are huge issues. All I can do is come to my conclusions on how I was able to get there. And if that helps in some way, great, but have no expectations that your path is going to look the same to those same, or that you might end up with those same conclusions. We're all on a journey, and we all have to walk our own journey, and there's nothing that I can do to walk it for you. And so don't hold up my experience as a candle to like, this is the where to try to achieve, because yours might look very different than mine. And at the same time, don't look at mine, I suppose, and snub your nose and say, well, I could have done that in 6 months, or why did it take you 23 years? Or, you know what I'm saying? Everybody's got their own path to walk, and it's going to look very different. And my path and my conclusions may look very different than yours, and that is more than okay. Okay. And to that, I will be looking somewhat to my computer, because I do have some poems saved here. I also have some notes, and I also have some quotes from a book, which I will put a link to in the description box below. So one of the books that I found the most, and I'm going to talk about it more, but this was towards the end of my experience as being Michael's mother and in this physical world, was a book called Learning to Fall. And I will put a link in the description box below, because I will say this, a lot of people do ask me for recommendations on books on grief or these types of things, and I'll be honest with you and say that I've read very few. I didn't have in the moment and in the time and when I was in the midst of things, I didn't have a lot of patience for a lot of the books that I was finding, because they very often were very cheerleader-like, which if you're in the midst of things, having somebody shaking pom-poms doesn't well, for me, just irritated me. And so I actually don't have a lot of book recommendations on specifically on certain topics. But one book that I continually go back to is a book called Learning to Fall. And the author of this book um, had ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, which my uncle actually passed away from. So, it's a horrifying disease, which the uncertain end. There's no cure. You know that you are rapidly moving towards, most often, fairly rapidly moving towards death, and that it's not going to be pleasant. Not that death is ever pleasant, but it's a gradual shutting down of all of your motor skills and kind of getting locked inside of your head. And it was terrible to watch with my uncle, and I can only imagine that it must be terrifying to live. He actually lived. The author actually lived for far longer than most people live with ALS, and so he wrote these vignettes along the way called Learning to Fall, in which he was literally writing about the process of learning to die, right? To learning to understand that this is part of life, and how do you do that, and how does that look? And that book, for one part of the equation, which is kind of learning to get comfortable with the concept of death, was instrumental, and it's a beautifully written book, and I highly recommend it. What it doesn't do, though, is teach you how to let go, which is a different aspect, right? He was learning how to come to terms with death for himself, and I will say, and we're going to talk about that some today, that is two separate things. Coming to terms, and you need both, but coming to terms with death and coming to terms with your own death, it can look very different than coming to terms with losing somebody that you love. Those are different experiences, even though they definitely overlap. But anyways, I did want to read this one quote on the topic of that we all have our own path to figure this out. He writes, "From childhood on, we are taught to be little Aristotles. We observe the world, we break down what we see into its component parts. We perceive problems and set about solving them, laying out our solutions in ordered sequences like the instructions for assembling a child's bicycle. We have gotten so good at this method that we apply it to everything. And so we have a magazine articles that tells us the 6 ways to find a mate, the 8 ways to bring greater joy into your life, the 10 elements of a successful family, and the 12 steps towards spiritual enlightenment. We choose to see life as a technical matter. And here's where we go wrong. For at its deepest levels, life is not a problem, but a mystery. The distinction, which I borrow from the philosopher Gabriel Marcel, is fundamental. Problems are to be solved. True mysteries are not. Personally, I wish I could have learned this lesson more easily without perhaps having to give up my tennis game. But each of us finds his or her own way to mystery. At one time or another, each of us confronts an experience so powerful, bewildering, joyous, or terrifying that all of our efforts to see it as a problem are futile. Each of us is brought to the cliff's edge. At such moments, we can either back away in bitterness or confusion, or leap forward into mystery. And what does mystery ask of us? Only that we be in its presence, that we fully, consciously hand ourselves over. That's all, and that is everything. We can participate in mystery only by letting go of solutions. This letting go is the first lesson of falling, and the hardest. Two things from that quote, the reason I even read this quote, is that we each find our own way to mystery. We each find our own way through mystery, and death is a mystery. And the second part is that, and this is obviously the synopsis of his entire book, is that we can only participate fully in that mystery when we learn to let go, and learning to let go, while his book is talking about letting go of life, or grasping onto life, and learning about dying in a personal sense. it is very much what, for me, learning to let go of somebody else that you love dearly is a whole process about letting go. So we find our way to mystery in our own way, and we have to come to a degree of learning to let go in our own way. And so I just wanted to make sure to highlight that. So given all of that, I do want to do a little bit of a backstory, especially as it pertains to this topic, because I don't know how else to approach this topic. I've often said that my spiritual path is completely tangled up in my experience with being Michael's mother, my son Michael. Being his mother and the process of learning how to do that, and to the best of my ability, is completely entwined with my becoming a grown-up human being. It's completely entwined with my finding my own spiritual path and practice and what that looks like. It's inextricable. I cannot separate the 2 or 3 or 4. All of the threads can't be separated, because who I am today is because of the process of learning to be Michael's mother, and obviously my daughter as well, which is a different story. So it does lead back to that. So for those of you who may not have watched my channel for very long, or stumbled on this in some way that doesn't include having any backstory, my son was, when I was 21-ish, I'm not great with time and ages, but when I was 21-ish, I gave birth to my first child. He was 6 weeks early. They had told us at the time, when I went into premature labor, I actually went into premature labor at 8 weeks early, and they did an ultrasound. Again, he would have been 29 this year. I'm old. He would have been, it's crazy to think he would have been almost 30, but I digress. So this was a while ago, and ultrasounds weren't maybe as fantastic as they are today, but they did an ultrasound to see whether or not they had gotten the dates wrong or something like that. And they told us at that time that he had achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism, because what they were seeing in the ultrasound was that his head was larger, and that the long bones, so the upper bone of the arms and the thigh bone of the legs, were shorter than normal, and so they felt that they diagnosed him as having achondroplasia. They put me on bed rest, which succeeded for about 2 weeks to hold off premature delivery, but then my water broke, and of course then he had to be born. So we had about 2 weeks to kind of come to terms with the fact that there was something physically wrong with him, and that combined with, obviously, in prematurity, that we were expecting to have some respiratory problems, and we were just coming to terms as very young people with how are we going to manage and deal with our expectations, or the stories that we expectant parents tell themselves about how it's going to look, this birth story and this raising your child and all of these things. You know, when you're given a diagnosis that completely flips that on its lid, you're having to rewrite all of these stories in your head, and that by itself is very scary. And then on top of that, of course, the prematurity is a little bit scary on top of that, because of the unknowns and the fact that, again, they were most concerned about his lung development. So again, we held it off for 2 weeks. When he was born, I remember, of course, the birth was very traumatic, just because there were so many other things on top of just normal traumatic birth that we were, having to process and deal with. But I remember that the moment that he was actually born, thinking, oh, they got it wrong. He's perfect. Like, he came out, he's small, but he was 5.5 pounds, which for a preemie was, you know, pretty solid looking, and he looked perfect. I didn't see him for very long. He kind of came out, which they had prepared me for. They would need to check him, make sure he's breathing and everything. So that instant moment that I saw him was, oh, he's perfect. There's, you know, they thank goodness, right? They were wrong. And then it very quickly went to him not breathing or not taking his first breath very quickly, and sort of the bustle that happens after that type of thing occurs, where, you know, there's a silence that happens where everybody's sort of rolled into doing their job and knowing that something isn't quite right. And so that moment of elation, and then that gut sinking feeling, it was that first moment where of a lifetime of intermingling of great joy and great fear or sorrow, or all of the emotions that come with difficult things. And that was literally that first moment of that really tight cohesion between joy and excruciating fear or pain or sorrow, and a lifetime of learning how to make those things coexist, because they will forever coexist. So he was taken to the, he wasn't taken to the intensive care immediately, but he was taken away to, you know, to deal with what was going on respiratory wise. I was cleaned up. I think I held, they may have just briefly put, I can't remember, to be honest. I think they briefly, I do feel like they briefly at least put him up where I could see him, but I don't believe I held him, because, and you know, I'll go into that more, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't because he wasn't catching his breath, so they just were doing their thing. So I was cleaned up, all of that, taken to my room, which unfortunately at the time was, you know, they were dual rooms. Our hospitals don't have, I think, dual rooms for maternity anymore, but at the time it was a joint room, which was excruciating as well, because there was so much fear going on and so much concern, and then you have this person in the next bed who's being brought their baby, and people are bringing balloons, and it was a really horrible experience. My ex, or my husband at the time, I had sent him home. It had been obviously a long day. They had said we wouldn't really hear anything for a while, so I was by myself in this room with somebody having this joyous experience of birth, and that was not what I was having. Anyways, I'm digressing, but that was a terrible experience. But they came, it feels like quite a long time later, they came, hours later, but it, you know, who knows, time goes weird. They brought him by in an incubator. I don't think that's the correct term. Maybe. No, I don't think that. In a, you know, it was a covered, that was definitely wrong, but I'm not editing, folks. I'm not editing. You know, in those beds that are completely covered, so that they can have oxygen and things of that nature in there for preemies. And so they brought him by in one of those, and at that time they told me that there was something severely wrong. There was something wrong with the structure of his rib cage, that he was struggling to breathe. They were going to take him to the intensive care, but that it did not look good in terms of his survival. Was, you know, wasn't going to probably live very long. And then they took him away. I think I was just in shock, and again, there was all of this stuff going on of happiness over here, and I was 21, and it was just a weird feeling, and I don't know how I fell asleep, but at some point I fell asleep, and I just remember the next morning, I was going to go down to see him really for the first time, to actually really be able to see him, look at him, touch him, and I just remember not wanting to do so, because I knew that, I mean, I already loved him. He was in my stomach. I mean, I'm one of those crazy people who I do love. I loved being pregnant. I was very much connected and bonded to him before he was ever born. But I knew that that moment was going to happen in which I was going to see him. I was going to touch him. Potentially, I didn't know if I'd be able to hold him. But I knew in that moment that I was going to be shattered, because as far as I was aware, he was not going to be living. I wasn't going to get to keep him. And so I remember dwaddling. I took a long shower. I just did everything that I could do to avoid it in some really weird way. And I finally, of course, went down and finally, of course, saw him and was finally, of course, shattered. It was, again, that moment of pure joy and soul recognition. This is my child. This is part of who I am. And at the same time, being completely shattered, believing at the time that he wasn't mine to keep, that I didn't get to have him for very long. So, you know, within that next day or so, they told us that there was something very much wrong with him. They didn't know what it was. They had sent his x-rays and things like that to Johns Hopkins Hospital to try to figure out what he had. But that he was not going to be living out the weekend, and that if we needed a priest to come, depending on our religion, they said, if you need a priest to come, anybody who you might want to see him, you know, you need to have them come, because he wasn't going to survive the weekend. And I was by myself again when they told me this, and I remember turning around and leaving the hospital, and because I was discharged relatively quickly, but obviously he was in the hospital. I turned around and left the hospital, and I remember I went home, totally took all of my clothes off, which wasn't something I would normally do in the middle of the day, and I got under the covers, literally, like, you know, like a little kid underneath the covers, and I just remember breaking. Like, that was the moment I felt like I had completely broke. And I remember that I had begged God to not take him. And I remember it very, very strongly, because I've spent many, many years feeling guilt over that moment, as if there was something, as if God had answered my prayer and caused Michael to live longer than he should have. And so then his suffering was even more of my, you know, so already parents who have children with genetic disabilities already have that, you know, weight of feeling guilt. However unrealistic and unfair that is to ourselves, we already feel a degree of guilt that somehow we caused this suffering to happen on our child. So not only that, but then on top of that was the added guilt of I shouldn't have begged, and because maybe God answered my prayer, and now my child is having to suffer because I was too weak to let go. So that was a key moment for me. That would play out, you know, across years. So that was the first time in which I was given with Michael a date or a time frame in which he was going to die, and was in that mode of, okay, well, now we're waiting. We're sitting here and we're waiting for him to die. He survived that weekend. The next weekend, he survived the weekend, and then we were told he wouldn't live out 2 weeks. He survived the 2 weeks, and at a month, we brought him home from the hospital with oxygen and monitors and things of that nature, and they told us to just enjoy him, because he wasn't going to live long. He certainly was not going to live out a year. That was very definitive. I do remember sending that doctor that told me that a picture of his 1-year picture, with a message that perhaps he might want to revise making such declarative statements about death. But one of the things I will say for that moment, which the doctor was very clear, and to enjoy the moments, because he simply wasn't going to live. I will say that the first part of that statement was so important because I did take that to heart. And I do think that partly because of that, partly just because of who I am and all of the other things, but partly because of that, I did very deliberately set about enjoying what I could of the ending up being 23 years that I had with my son. Understanding that life is on a knife point and then it changes in a moment, and that life is, finite. We are born to die, right? We literally, the moment we are born, we are all dying. So nobody is going to live forever. Death is part of our human experience, both for ourselves and for the people that we love. And I do believe that, especially in the West, I can't speak to all cultures, but especially in the West, I do believe that we have a unhealthy experience with, or understanding of, and resistance to death when it is just simply part of the human experience. And I think that that does cause more difficulty than the experience is needed. I know I'm going to hit some. I'm trying to stay precise, but I'm trying to stay precise, but I know I'm going to be hitting rabbit trails. So him coming home, we came home with him at a month. He's not going to live out the year. Enjoy the time that you have. Just, enjoy his experience of being his parents, because that's what you are going to get, and it's going to be a small allotment of time. They did diagnose him with asphyxiating thoracic dystrophy, or June syndrome. It was a misdiagnosis that we would not know until he was 18 years old. Lots of feels about that, but that's a whole another video. They did the best they could. They simply didn't have the genetic testing that they had by the time he was 18, but he was misdiagnosed. But basically his rib cage, from what they could tell, his rib cage on his right side was quite malformed, and his ribs were small, and they kind of went inward instead of the nice barrel that you want for your lungs. His rib cage was smaller and more restricted, and especially on his right side, it was very restricted, and so this caused respiratory problems. He also had other problems with liver. He had problems being able to eat enough or get enough calories into him. From what we understood, now again, when he was 18, once we realized what he actually had, it made far more sense. But at the time, the only thing we could center on was he had to work so hard to breathe that he burnt a lot more calories, and we simply had a struggle then his whole life with getting in enough calories for him to thrive, physically thrive. And so he was in and out of hospitals for failure to thrive a lot, because we just couldn't get enough calories in him to combat all of the calories that he was burning. But his main problem from birth was respiratory related, with his ability to breathe. Also made him susceptible to getting sick a lot more. And so that, coming home with, he's going to live for a year, while he did live out longer than the year, it did start a chain of experiences in which we were in the final days, and we were waiting for him to pass multiple times. And so unfortunately, it's a waiting for somebody that I loved to pass away was a continual theme of my entire adulthood. So I know we're half an hour at least in, and I really haven't talked much more than about this experience, but I promised myself the only way I could kind of go here was to just say I wasn't going to over edit. I wasn't going to censor self over much, and just let this be what this is. And so there we go. The point of the story, of my story, is that learning to live with deadlines of when Michael was going to pass away was something that expands the rest of his lifetime. There were multiple times in which we were given final diagnosis of, call the people who need to see him. He was given wrong diagnoses when he was 8 of AIDS and then leukemia. When he was in a rapid decline, there were periods in which he understood at 8 that he could actually die, and having to work through with him, what does that mean to be an 8-year-old knowing that you could very potentially really die, and being the mother to somebody who has to come to terms with that then for the rest of his life. There were just many moments of this learning to deal with this. Up until he was 18, in which, and I'll try to speed this up, and up in which he was 18, he was actually, his spine started to collapse because your lungs and your ribcage and your lungs actually keep your spine straight, and when that's not being able to do that, by that point his right lung was pretty much always collapsed on the bottom. It wasn't functioning at the bottom part half of his lung. His spine started to collapse in, started to pinch off his airway. We went to do a major surgery that would hopefully open that pinch up. He was not able to do the surgery. Just the act of giving him blood and platelets just in the morning of the surgery caused him to crash, and the doctors said at that point that they could do no harm. Their job is to help and not to hurt. And at this point, anything that they did would simply be causing destruction on his body that simply couldn't take any more intervention. And we were told then the final time in which we were told it was time to stop fighting and searching for health solutions, and it was time to make him comfortable and move into palliative, waiting for him to pass. At that time, his lungs were pretty bad, and they did say probably the next case of pneumonia would, be the end of that. And so I crashed at that point, but I think I'll come back to that in a moment. He lived for about 3 years after that, and then he passed away. So, I know, that's it's an important half an hour though, because I want to be very clear that my experience with learning to wait for someone to die, learning to come to terms with the fact that there's no more fighting, there's no more struggle, there's no more medicine that's going to change it, a surgery that's going to change it, and now we're just waiting and being present with that person and with ourselves, was a long journey of 23 years, whereas many people, the people that I know personally who are facing this right now, many people are thrust into this situation as I was at the very first time, right out of the blue, not really being prepared for it, not having a vast amount of time. And there's downsides to having to deal with that for 23 years, but there's also downsides to being thrown into that circumstances out of the blue. So my experience is going to look very different than other people's experience. And so taking my reactions and my ways of processing as being something that you should do or shouldn't do, or whatever kind of comparison might be going on, it's just simply not fair to you. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to anybody, because we all have such different experiences. I will say that, to try to get into the actual answering of the question, I don't know that I ever have particularly gotten good at waiting for, at that moment in which they say, This is it. We're now just waiting. I actually don't think all of that work that I felt like I did, which I'm going to talk about for, because it's all I can bring to the table. I don't think in the end, well, I won't say that. I was going to say that I don't think in the end that really helped, but I'm sure that it did, right? I'm sure that it did. I'm sure that it affected the way in which I processed it. But in the end, we are very human beings in a very vulnerable, very painful situation. And no matter how much work you may or may not do leading up to that, there's no escaping the fact that we're humans. We love the people. We love our mom. We love our dad. We love our children. We love our spouse. We love our partner. We love who we love. And letting go when the time comes of that person is going to be excruciating, no matter how prepared we may think that we are. And I think that allowing it to be okay to fall to pieces in that moment is really important, because in the end, 23 years of work on my part to come to terms with death, with dying, with my child not going to outlive me for of all, as far as we can tell, barring accidents, all the work that I did to get to that point, and I still shattered into 1,000 pieces, and I still felt like I was hit by a train, and I still felt like I wasn't prepared, and I still felt like everything that I knew about life and reality broke into a million pieces. So some of this aspect of dealing with such a major event such as death, we simply have to lean into. One of the quotes from the book Learning to Fall is that I'm going to do really bad here. I thought I had it prepared, but I did not. Here it is. Think again of falling as a figure of speech. We fall on our faces, we fall for a joke, we fall for someone, we fall in love. In each of these falls, what do we fall away from? We fall from ego. We fall from our carefully constructed identities, our reputations, our precious selves. We fall from ambition, we fall from grasping, we fall, at least temporarily, from reason. And what do we fall into? We fall into passion, into terror, into unreasoning joy. We fall into humility, into compassion, into emptiness, into oneness. With forces larger than ourselves, into oneness with others whom we realize are likewise falling. We fall at last into the presence of the sacred, into godliness, into mystery, into our better, diviner natures. When we learn to fall, we learn to accept the vulnerability that is our human endowment, the cost of walking upright on the earth. That to me really well, the whole book speaks to me. Read the book. That's all I can say there. And I mean, you may hate the book, but read the book. It is part of the human experience to fall into joy, to fall into terror, to fall into excruciating love and mind-blowing pain at the loss of that love or that connection, at least on the physical plane. It is part of the human experience, and so it's just a natural part of the experience, and I think that that's what I tried to work on. So going back to the answer of how did I try to cope with all of this? My first coping was untangling my past belief about death and the afterlife. I was raised in a very fundamental religious mindset that had a literal hell, fiery place in which people were burning for eternity, and maggots and demons and all of that. So that was a very real thing. And so I was always terrified of dying and people around me dying. My religious upbringing didn't believe that you lost your salvation, but I was always concerned that there was this line that you could cross, and that moment that line was crossed, that you were damned forever. And so the fear of death and dying was actually something that was a great part of my younger years. And so when this occurred with Michael being born and then instantly being given death time frames and all of that kind of thing to a very young, very innocent, very naive young person, those things collided, where my understanding of what death means and what death is meant something to how I processed somebody that I loved dying. So for me, the first part of dealing with waiting for somebody that I love to die was me coming to terms with death itself. And so that was something that I struggled with. But after a while, I would like to say, it seems to me as if just by nature of it being constantly present, and it was constantly present, especially the first 6 years. Then he had surgery on his rib cage, and he had a couple pretty good years, and then at 8 it was really bad, and then he'd have a few years of, again, always something going on, but not like a constant. But the first 6 years were a constant knife's edge of is this the time? Is this the cough? In fact, I wrote one of the poems when I was looking through a poem, said, is just titled A Cough. And it says, that single sound pierced the walls and my very soul. Instant, overwhelming fear. Helpless fear. Rage fear. Worry fear. Frustration fear. Debilitating, demoralizing, desiccating, defeating, and utterly draining fear. So that constant, you just hear the sound of a cough and you think, we're going to the hospital tomorrow. It gets to where the change in breathing, the sound of a particular cough that he would make, where you thought, okay, here we go. And it was a constant thing. And some degrees of that constantness does develop a comfort level of, okay, I simply cannot remain terrified of death itself for so much amount of time. There's a certain point in which you simply have to let go. And I actually know the exact date in which that happened, because as I was wont to do at the time, I wrote a poem about it. And so I know that it was on June 7th, 1998. And it says, death has walked beside me now for many years and taught me how to fear and rage against a fate that we on earth cannot escape. It was an enemy of mine that had advantage over time. It turned my fear against me, so myself became my greatest foe. I could not fight this wily fiend, and so I turned it into my friend. Death and life are just the same, rebirth known by a different name. Just as light restores the soul, so does dark make fragments whole. If death I always fight and flee, then life would lose all joy for me. And so 7 years or so after the birth of Michael is when apparently I at least came to some sort of conclusion that death is just part of life, and I can't struggle against something like that. It is simply a mystery of our human existence, and that was an important thing for me. So coming to terms with death myself was important. Coming to terms with letting go of there having to be a reason was another really important thing for me personally. I really struggled with the why. And again, our lives are complicated. Our psyches are complicated. Who we are complicated. Much of that had to do with struggles that I was having to let go of a very, very, and again, this is not speaking to the standard Christian, but to a very fundamental form of Christianity in which I was personally asked by more than one person and very close friends in the church situation what I had done that Michael was born the way that he was. There is a, not on all Christians, but in a mindset in which there is such a black and white mentality and good people are rewarded and bad people go to hell, it sets up a dynamic for people to misunderstand, misformulate, misintegrate into their mind, and come to the conclusion that if your child is born with a life-threatening disease, you must have done something to cause that to happen. And that, so a lot of the whys, I was a good girl. I remember even thinking, like, I was so sweet, and I was so naive, and I was so innocent, and yet I was so full of questions. And I just, while one part of me categorically denied any potential for it to have been an act of punishment that my son would have a disease, when people that you love, that are part of your friendship group, that are part of your religious group, ask those kinds of questions, it still puts that thing into your head that says, but what if it did? What if it did? And it was linked towards, by one or two people, by having had premarital sex. And I do remember thinking to myself, there should be a whole lot of sick children if that's the case, because that's just crazy. And so a big part of my brain said no. And that was part of my breaking away completely from religion. But there's still, when you put that into somebody's head, that in some way they didn't have enough faith, or they did something wrong, or they didn't put out enough intention into the world, or they're putting out bad energy into the world, or they're not doing it right, and this is causing these consequences. When you extrapolate that to the extreme, it can cause damage, and it can put that little voice, and we don't need any help with little voices, right? So that was a big thing for me, as to why is this happening? I just wanted to know, why did this happen? He was literally suffering, and there were times in which he was very little and was physically in pain and suffering in a way that I saw all kinds of people living out their entire life and not suffering in that way. And so the why of this became so kind of mind consuming to me. For me, the book that kind of brought all of that to a head was the Tao of Pooh, which I've talked about before on my channel. And I can't even point to a specific place necessarily in the book, but that the book as a whole, and the concept of just letting go and stopping struggling against something that you can't change. Birth and death are part of the human existence. They are a natural part of the human existence. Suffering is part of the human experience, no matter how we want to obviously work towards not suffering. It's part of the human experience, and there wasn't ever going to be, what I finally came to terms with, is that there wasn't ever going to be a satisfactory answer, right? So when I'm looking at my child suffering, or in the end, when I am looking at my child in the process of dying, or if somebody's looking in the process of their mother passing, or their father passing, or their partner, or whoever this might be, there is never going to be a satisfactory answer as to why this had to be the way it is. Somebody could come up to me and give the best answer, this best explanation, this wonderful experience of understanding of what maybe Michael's soul is learning in this experience, and that he chose maybe this life that he's living, and that he's going on to this amazing experience in the next life. They could come up with the perfect thing to say as to why something is happening, and it won't be good enough, right? It wouldn't be good enough in that moment of sitting with someone as they pass, or in that moment of watching somebody that you love suffer. There's no answer that is going to satisfy And so to letting go of that question was important for my sanity, and it was important for my own learning as a human being, that there are questions that are unanswerable, or at least not satisfactory answerable. And that book and the concepts of Taoism, and then from there into some of the concepts in Buddhism, were instrumental in allowing me to let go of the whys, allowing me to just deal with what is as it comes, just lean into the experience, deal with the experience as it comes, be fully present in the experience as it comes, and understand that this is just part of my human experience. Was part of Michael's human experience. It's just part of life and part of death. And that was really huge for me. So coming to terms with just death in general, and letting go of fear of death or fear of what was going to happen, and then letting go of having to have an explanation, or trying to find a satisfactory explanation as to why. Those were two very big things for me, very big lessons that were learned that didn't happen in a minute. They did. Like, I can, both of those things, I can point to exact moments in which they clicked into place, but they didn't happen in an instant. It was a lifetime up until that point coming into being, and then it clicked into place. So those two things were very important for me. But when it came right down to what is really being asked of me, or to address, is when we knew we were at that point, which again, we did so many times. So I think that colors my experience, right? So when we actually came to this point where the doctor said we can't do anything else, or we're causing more harm than we're causing good, and we had to stop fighting after, at that point, he was 18, so he might have actually have turned 19 at that point. We were told at that point there was nothing else to do, and that he was in the process of decline. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what to do with that, because when you have a sick child, or if you're in a treatment, you're helping like a parent or a sibling or a partner or a child go through treatment, your world is really funneled in on healthcare, medications, oxygen for him, oxygen, feeding, food, calories, like everything from the moment of his birth until that point had really been focused in, funneled in around what do we do to give him the best quality of life? What do we do to give him the best care? What do we do to give him the best potential for life, and for a good life, and for a pain-free life? Everything was focused around that. And so to hit that moment which is what we're talking about here, for a lot of different people, when they come in and they say, we're at the end of the treatment road, and now we're waiting for death to occur, which is what we're doing. I literally didn't know how to do that. I did not know how to stop fighting. I didn't know how to stop researching. I didn't know how to exist as his mother without fighting. And I definitely fell apart. I definitely had a breakdown. I slept a lot. I was definitely in a full-on, what I would consider to be, I'm not somebody who I think is struggles with depression any more than outside of like understandable circumstances where you can, for me, like, let's say depression is it's a physical thing, just like having a headache, or having a certain particular type of disease in which chemicals aren't working correctly. And so what is happening in the world outside doesn't necessarily match the way that the person is feeling. So all of the struggles that I had with anxiety and depression were very relatable to my world around me. And so I hit that where it was just a breakdown of I just did not know how to function. And I feel like I went fairly, and it wasn't that I wasn't functioning, like I was functioning, I was going through the routine, but not at my not at my peak. And definitely internally I was shut down. I just didn't know how to handle it. I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to function in that way. And that lasted for about a year. I did end up getting, thankfully, the oncologist who was his primary care, Michael's primary care, their floor had, the oncology floor had gotten a resident psychologist come in for counseling for family and for either the kids and the kids with pediatrics, so kids or their family members. And so I went to see him, and it was helpful. It was helpful. And he even said, he was fantastic. And he said, you know, you're very self-aware. You've clearly done all of this work leading up to this. He's like, the only thing that I'm here for is to listen and to give you a space, a safe space to say whatever it is you need to say. And so that was helpful. But I remember that when I came out of that year, I had lost a lot of filters. I had lost what I call the bullshit factor. A lot of life does hinge a bit on, or it shouldn't, but it does, I think, hinge on the bullshit factor. There are things that we're willing to compromise. There are things that we're willing to say to be polite, to keep relationships intact, to maintain social decorum. And I felt like all of that was missing. It had just simply eradicated. I didn't have patience for anything stupid. I had no tolerance for stupidity or ignorance or just anything. I had zero tolerance. Life was very, very really short. Life was very, very real and fragile. And all of this bullshit that we get so caught up in and so focused on is seen very clearly for what it is, which is bullshit. And so I had, but that's difficult. Like sometimes we need the bullshit factor, and I apologize, I don't generally cuss a lot, but that's what I call it. It was the bullshit factor, and I lost it. It was like gone. Whatever that filter was broken. And so things definitely changed quite dramatically in ways I'm not going to go into because it's a different story. But my whole point is that, after all that work, so we're talking about 19 years of work, having achieved a great degree of comfort and friendship with death. I can to this day say I have zero, and I'm not trying to be silly about it or flippant about it, but I have no concern about death. Death doesn't concern me. Death doesn't worry me. What happens next is not even the beginning on my radar for myself or for Michael. That was, the death itself was not an issue for me at all. And all the work that I had done on accepting that death was part of life, it was part of this experience. All that work was fine and dandy, but when it comes down to the physical letting go of somebody that you love, it didn't matter. All of that pre-work, so to speak, doesn't matter because you're facing that instance with loss, the potential of loss that can be devastating. I did try to read some books in that time period, especially the last 2 years. I did try to read some books on it, but again, the bullshit factor being broken, I did feel like a lot of the books were just cheerleaders making noise. It just felt like noise, and it felt like trying to sugarcoat a very difficult decision or situation, and it just didn't feel relevant to me. And so going about living being very present with the person and with whatever it is that you're feeling in that moment was really all that was left to do. And I don't have any great answers on how to do that, to how to do that waiting, because I do feel in some ways I feel like I failed miserably, and in other ways I think that I just had a very human experience with a very human situation, and there's no right and wrong way to deal with that. Now I will say that as a mother, it does I'm not going to say it's not easier, because I actually think it's the worst thing on the planet. But there is a degree of needing as a mother to protect your child, protect your other children. I had my daughter Katie. And so there is a degree of needing to keep one foot in front of the other, as we've been doing for all these years, because I had a child who needed to enjoy his life and be comfortable in his life as long as he had that life. I had a daughter who was, at an age in which life was supposed to be wonderful and changing and vibrant, and she needed to be able to function and continue forward on her life. And so that does offer some degree of you focus your energy in on that person. And I do think that that is something that I would offer as a suggestion, that if you're in a situation in which you are sitting with somebody who is going to pass, that you have an opportunity to be with a person in a momentous part of this physical life, which is their passing, right? So with my son, I was there, fully present for his birth into this body, and then I was given the opportunity, however wretched it was, to be very fully present in the end of his life, in his last days and years, and then months, and then days. And that is a gift that you can give the person that you are with, to simply be present with them. Is, I think, an amazing gift, and maybe that's all that's required. It's not required that it look a perfect way, or that you feel a perfect way, or anything of that nature, but that you simply are present with somebody in a massive moment in their physical existence, and to simply be there and be present as much as you can. So that carried through and for a couple years, 2 years more, I guess 2 more years. And he got sick, and I know it started, there was a point in which, again, this is for people who are in this situation, it did get to be a point in which the fear became less of how long he was going to live, and the fear became that he was going to live too long and be suffering to a degree in which we can't keep him comfortable. And so that shift occurs sometimes. Depends on the length of the time that you are in this situation. That that might be over a course of days or weeks or months, or it may be over the course of years, in which the concern shifts to wanting them to live as long as they possibly can, to I don't want him to live so long and that he is going to suffer simply because I want him to be here. And so that was hard to deal with. And again, just taking each thing as it came and doing everything that we could to make him comfortable and present. But he was definitely declining in mornings. His respiratory in the mornings were worse, and things were definitely getting rough. But I still had no indication. He got sick and was getting out of being sick. He had just gone to the doctor. He was over his cold. We'd all been sick. And, he was feeling a little bit better. We had decorated the Christmas tree, although he'd slept a lot. But we had decorated the Christmas tree in my apartment and had a nice evening. And the next morning he was struggling very badly. And that afternoon he went into the hospital, and then he died the next day. And many people would suppose that because of the lifetime that we had, that I wouldn't have been surprised or shocked or thrown off my balance, or that it was something that I knew was going to happen. In fact, many, unfortunately, many people made the comment that at least you knew it was going to happen. Please don't say that to people. Please don't ever assume that somebody isn't completely devastated and completely sideswiped by multiple semi-trucks, no matter what their experience is. So for those that are listening who are not going through this, but maybe know other people who are, mind your mouth. Be a gatekeeper of the mouth, right? Just say, I'm sorry. Is there anything that I can do to help you? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do to help you? And keep saying, I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do to help you? That's all that is required. Because anything that tries to make the situation seem lighter or easier or anything of that nature is probably going to come off not in a good way, right? No matter what, no matter how long your journey is sitting with your parent or your child or your partner or your friend or whoever that might be, no matter what that journey looked like in that moment, it's devastating. It's devastating and it is unexpected. And it is difficult. And there's nothing that I can say to make that easier for those of you who are doing that. And the only thing that I can say in answer to the question of how is just one day at a time, and to just try to find a way to be present with that person all the way to the end. To just be present with them and to experience that with them. You're experiencing something and they're experiencing something, and to be very human together, I think is all that you can do. And it's all the advice that I would even ever bother to try to offer. So I don't know, to be honest, if any of this is of any use to the people who requested the video, or to anybody just randomly coming on this who is experiencing this. Again, for myself, coming to terms with what death means to me and letting go of fear of death was very important. Letting go of the whys for me was very important, in understanding that I would never have a satisfactory answer as to why I was having to deal with this, why my son was having to deal with this, while lots of other people live their lives and don't deal with that same thing. Although, again, we will all deal with death at one point or another. But letting go of that was very important to me. Learning to be present in the moment. Taking that moment, that day, that hour, that second, whatever the time frame you need to take as it comes, was and continues to be very important to me. And to, above all else, give yourself some grace. Give yourself the same grace that you would afford to somebody else, because I thought I knew how I would deal with my son's passing. I'm a person who tends to shut down, and then when I'm by myself, I will deal with things. I am a person who tends to be very internal. I don't generally cry a lot in front of people, and I really believed that I knew exactly how I would deal with those last few days. And I thought that I knew exactly how I would function and deal with the actual moment of his passing and then the aftermath. And I did not. I did not. I completely shattered into 1,000 million pieces. I could see myself as if I was on the roof of the ceiling, watching myself fall completely into pieces. And it was in the moment the most excruciating, and it was also the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me. And it continues to haunt me at times because I don't like a loss of control, and there were a lot of people around. I have had to, since then, retroactively have grace for myself, right? That I am a very human person who went through an excruciating human experience, and that whatever that looks like is okay. Whatever that looks like is normal and natural, and then going about the business, which is a whole, obviously a whole other business of dealing with the aftermath. So, my last piece of advice is to give yourself grace in this experience, because it's a very, there's no way, I don't believe, to erase the fact that it is going to be difficult and it is going to be painful, and that we are taught to push and push and fight and fight and push and push and fight and fight, and we are taught to just keep that go, treatment, do this, do that, do this. It's part of our cultural mindset, at least again here in the West. And so letting go and just setting in an experience, I think, is very disconcerting for a lot of people. For a lot of people, I think it's very disconcerting. But to just figure out a way to just be present and to have grace for yourself, have grace for that person that you're with. And that's all that matters. That's all that matters in that moment, is grace for yourself and for the person that you are sitting in this space with, is all that matters in the end. So we kind of started all this with Phillip Simmons and his learning to fall. But this idea of grace, though, it's a very important word to me. And so we might as well wrap it up with the last quote from the book, although there's just tons. Again, just read the book. We are all of us, falling. We are all now, this moment, in the midst of that descent, fallen from heights that may now seem only a dimly remembered dream, falling toward a depth we can only imagine, glimpsed beneath the water's surface shimmer. And so let us pray that if we are falling from grace, dear God, let us also fall with grace to grace. If we are falling toward pain and weakness, let us also fall toward sweetness and strength. If we are falling toward death, let us also fall toward life. So yeah, I think that if you were to pick one keyword towards the experience that many people have experienced and or are experiencing right now, if I could pick one word to gift you, this wonderful treasure of a word, it would be to have grace. Just have grace for yourself. If you know somebody who is experiencing this, please have grace for that person. Offer them your help in any way that you can, but have grace for yourself and have grace for the person that you are experiencing the real reality of life, which encompasses death as well. I am so sorry for anybody who finds this to be a relevant conversation, and I do wish you so much grace in this walk that you are on.